So, yeah, reps in reserve can be another method you use to regulate training load. How far from your absolute max? And a lot of the research supports is that
Yep.
we want to be just shy in terms of muscle hypertrophy. You want to be just shy of it, because we're able to actually create more training volume
Yep.
without hitting maximal thresholds. In terms of strength training, we probably want to be a little bit further away. Say, instead of one to 2 reps, you maybe make 2 to 3 reps away from maximal effort to get the best stimulation for strength, and tissue tolerance, and slow adaptation progression from a further distance, say 4 reps working to 3 to 1 reps in reserve, getting closer and closer to.
Yeah. So let's talk autoregulation. How do you apply it and how do you use it? Because I've noticed it's the biggest difference to me with the training that you've applied to me currently. That's the biggest difference I've had from other programs. Let's
first define autoregulation. So, autoregulation basically allows, and basically it's a method that regulates training load for a desired intensity outcome. Now, there are various models to do so that you can utilize for different athletes for different purposes.
Yep.
So the most common form of auto-regulation that we utilize, and I currently utilize a fair bit, is RPE.
Yep.
Now, I got you on a training program using RPE, and you had a bit of feedback on that. So, what are your experiences with?
Well,
so far,
I mean, it was my first foray into RPE. So it took me. I think it took me one training cycle to actually work out to get some consistency in my RPE. Like I can know what an 8 feels like now. I know what a 7 feels like. I just know. Whereas week to week, what I said was an 8 probably wasn't. You know what I mean? It kind of, I didn't know myself well enough. But so for anybody listening, how it looks like on my program is the autoregulation is you're aiming to hit a load within a range, right? So you can either go from, I don't know, say it's 110 to 120.
Almost. So it's what I do that allows it to make it more objective. So I collect a huge amount of subjective data to then create objective measures. So because RPE is subjective, we can't get perfect measurements, but we can use a form of descriptions or feeling, the way something feels, to try and assign that a number to give a desired effect. So this allows us to stay within a tolerable load that allows some sort of progression on a day-to-day and a week-to-week cycle.
Yeah.
So it can be used in 2 ways. Is that in a prescriptive manner, it allows me to regulate the training load that you're in. And if we can make progression at a various, ideal intensity, we know we're probably progressing overall.
Yeah.
Then there's feedback on giving your feedback on your RPE scale on what something feels like, to kind of get a gauge on how something feels and whether that is progressing over time.
Yep.
So if something is feeling easier over time, we're probably progressing.
Right. So if those RPE numbers go down week to week, but you're using the same load, we know there's progress being made.
The idea here is that we want you to get the most out of days that are good and back off on days that aren't so good, because having exact numbers is too hard to account for, especially on days of high stress that we might or might not be fully recovered, and could expose us to a risk of injury. So RPE is usually used in something that you would lift to a number to it feels a certain way, and then each week you might utilize that number as a gauge to where that week will go. So this is where I created an objective measures that I use historical data to then create a possible estimated training load for the following weeks. So if I have 8 RP for 3 reps in, say, slot B
Yep.
for your exercise thing, then I know that next week we could hit a similar range depending on the recovery. So then if next week you should be close to or be able to improve on that RPE. If it improves, then I'll use that data to then progress next week's training ranges. So I will also give that range within a 5% range or 2.5% range on that, on each end of it, to regulate down or up. So this also applies a level of constraint to the athlete so that they don't go overboard or pull back too much. Because you can feel 8 RPE very early on in training, but the RPE may decrease as we increase load, and that's something that does happen. So
Yes.
we want to have some sort of historical data to start to make this subjective information a little bit more reliable.
Yeah, so I find, it's funny you said that. So I find a lot when I'm doing 3 sets, my second set is always my most comfortable. Even if I've gone up in weight, and the first set almost becomes a warm-up set, doesn't it? But yeah, I say we're doing squats and we're doing triples. I always find my second set, even if I've gone up in weight, feels the same RPE as the first set.
This is why you want that historical data.
Yeah.
Because we can create those comparisons and you as a lifter should start to know yourself and can create and can start to understand how you can regulate your training. The other part of this is that as a coach, I could utilize a method, which I do with a few athletes, is that I'll have primer sets. So it'll be something that is like, say, a few percent off what your top sets are. So it might regulate something at 7 RPE.
Yep.
Or have some percentages that are lower than it to prime them for their top sets. So giving them less sets of the top sets, have primer sets up to it, which you could use a form of pyramid, because then they'll perform better in their top sets. Again, that's just knowing both the psychological and physiological profile of an athlete to then try and work out the best programming method for with it, and that could be RPE. Actually, this brings us an idea too, is that you're saying that you always like to hit the higher end.
Right. So I was going to say that how do you factor in the psychology of a lifter? Because when I see, this session you go from 110 to 120, I'm going to 120. There's just every time. If it's there, I'm going for it. And to be honest, it doesn't really matter how much I feel. If the numbers are there, if somebody tells me I should aim for that, I can find it to get there. I can always do it. I'm in the second cycle at the moment, right? And I'm still making beginner gains because I was plateaued for like fucking 5 years or something. So I'm still making big jumps, right? So I'm nowhere near strong enough for this to be an issue. So I find myself that I'm actually going past my upper end as well a lot. And so is that something you have to adapt between lifters? Because obviously some people are far more likely to push themselves more.
Yes, so this is knowing your athlete. So there is a couple of things. First off, the models I give are constrained models.
Yeah.
So let's say you did do a pyramid scheme, so you went 100, 110, 120, hit your max at 120. I'm only going to use the average of that in the next week, so that at least the average load of that is going to be progressive.
Right.
If you do hit the higher end of that, it's only 2.5% higher, very conservative jump.
Yeah.
On the average load rather than the peak load. So your peak load will be 120, but I'll keep you closer to 110. So if you do hit more sets at 110, around 110 instead of starting at 100, then at least over those next 3 sets in the following week, we have at least progressed training load.
Right.
In some form. So, that is one type of constraint. Number 2, the other type of constraint I put in is that as long as your reporting is accurate, you were meant to hit 8, but you hit a 9. As long as you report that correctly, I will regulate the load for the following week to be down. But my algorithm already does that.
Yeah.
For me. essentially some people aren't going to be well adapted to that, to RPE, because they're going to want to always just hit more and report whatever they feel like reporting.
Right. So I was going to say, do you run into people who, what do they do? They get liberal with the truth, shall we say? So they want to hit as high as possible. You've told them to aim for an 8.
Mm-hmm.
Do you get people who push to a 9 or a 10 and report it as an 8?
Yeah, it happens. So that's just you being as a coach knowing how to prescribe it. Because RP might not work for that person.
Right.
You could use other methods. You can just use percentages. Stick them within a percentage. And usually when I use percentages, I'll still use a range. So if it's 80%, it really is between 77.5% and 82.5%. And they can hit between that. You can. So if sometimes their reporting isn't good, we can rely on videos, But as long as they keep, as if a beginner, as long as you keep reporting, they'll learn what it is. For someone who is really extreme, who doesn't care, they just want to hit bigger numbers. Again, we'll have to apply other constraints of some kind to prevent them from overdoing it. And we could just be, setting the numbers that they're supposed to hit. You can increase the volume of work, so we could hit, 80% for 5 sets over time. That's enough volume for them to not want to have a overzealous jump.
So you basically wear them out enough where they're going to be less likely to push themselves.
Yeah, because they're going to get more out of doing volume than they are trying to push themselves.
Yeah.
So a lot of programming is based off profiling. Being able to profile the right correctly for the right person, and just talking with the athlete. But some people just aren't gonna listen. There are other models to RPE as well. Well, first off, do you have any more questions about that?
I'd love to know that amongst your top lifters across the board, are there all quite similar on this subject? Do they are they all completely truthful? Do they report properly, or there's a lot?
Yeah, most of them will report properly. It's also having control of the people, not like a bad form of control, but knowing how to first tell them off, educating, and letting them make mistakes.
Right.
They're all part of it. So if I have people who are overzealous, it's like, I may give them warning. I might let them do it. I explain what could happen, and more often than not, what I explain happens. They peaked too early for competition. They've hurt themselves, and it's like, cool. Now this time round, I'm not going to be on top of them that hard, because sometimes it's not going to work unless they make the mistake.
Yep.
So I don't get that as much. You might get it a couple of times here and there randomly because they felt really good, want to do it. I let them, but I educate them and give them understanding, like, if you do that, here's what you're opening yourself up to.
Yeah.
I'm not angry or anything, just, I keep them aware, because then but I use a combination of methods. Now it's more about when it comes to periodization, there's a thing I use. It's called an index.
Right.
So generally it's an index that gives you a rough indication of location to a peaked effort for competition. And so you can use all sorts of methods. You can use, like, what percentage of intensity do you want them at, what RP do you want them at, or you can just give an overview of, a scale of 1 to 5, which is the traditional model of doing it. 5 being the absolute peak for competition, 4 being off, like, being just off something for competition, 1 being non-specific, far away from competition. So you can use various methods to keep them within a range that is within a range to competition, and getting the most we can out of those areas using various methods to maintain a level of constraint and progression at the same time. Now, for other methods, so there is percentage-based methods with reporting. So if they then report RPE on a percentage base, it gives us a good indicator about how we can progress. Because percentages, the downfall with that is that we can't regulate load. We can't regulate load based off how strong they might be or what they can express. So we could be understimulated or overstimulated. So if
the only information you've got is that they've hit that percentage. You don't know how well they hit it, how they felt when they did it.
But they could be, at this stage, they could relatively be weaker. So us hitting a higher percentage could actually be too high. Or they could be much stronger and the percentages we're hitting are too low and not in a stimulative load.
Right.
So getting sort of RP feedback from that can then allow us to then put their percentages relative to what their report is. So that gives me control over the position of their lifting in relative distance between their competition. Besides RP, there's also another method which I like, but I don't use at this stage. It's called reps in reserve. I've used.
Right. So what's the difference between reps in reserve, rate of perceived? So I've always been a bit confused about this because RP is based on how many more reps you could do.
Yes and no. It's based off another model of exertion for endurance-based training, which is out of 20, and so it's something like 6 or 7 out of 20. So set between 6 and 7 to 20. So you give a ranking on how that felt, and it's being built from basically the intensity of your heart rate. So 20 being at 200. 15 being at 150, so you kind of build a relative RP for that. But now we have watches, that do it also. That that kind of model is obsolete now when you have very accurate measures for heart rate. The model has been adapted to lifting from 1 to 10. I don't know exactly the reason why it's 1 to 10, but my assumption is that 10 being 100% of your 1 rep max is kind of the easy way to do it. 8 to 8.5 is roughly the 80 to 85% percentile mark. But it's also the distance between your max effort. So, a rough way to indicate that is reps in reserve, or how many reps you have left in the tank. So if you have if you did five reps for 8 RPE, you'd roughly have 2 reps left in the tank. So by the 5th rep, you can start to feel, if I did 2 more, could I do 2 more, and would I fail on the 3rd? Which means you have 2 reps left in the tank. That's roughly 8 RPE.
Isn't that the same? So is 2 RIR the same as 8 RPE then?
Pretty much, but you directly measure just reps in reserve. So you'll give a 2 reps in reserve if you feel like you have 2 reps left.
Yeah.
So if you prescribe, with reps in reserve, you would more prescribe a little bit of a range, because it's actually pretty hard to tell the difference between 1 and 2 reps in reserve, or no to 1. So you might give a little bit of a range, and then you'll give feedback on what they think it might be. It's just a little bit more. It can feel a little bit more intuitive to give an exact number, but the difference between 1 and 2 isn't too different.
No.
Anyway, in terms of even the stimulus you're aiming for. So usually you might prescribe, say, instead of an 8 RPE, you might go 1 to 2 reps in reserve. Now, the further that reps in reserve is, or same with RPE, let's say we hit 4 to 5 RPE, it gets really hard to differentiate, because anything, say, less than 3 to 4, or greater than 3 to 4 reps in reserve, feels roughly the same.
Yeah.
And same thing when it comes to high rep work. Anything above anything above, say, 8 to 10 reps, it's going to be hard to work out how many more reps.
I would have I would have absolutely no idea. Once I hit 10, I could do another 5, I could do another 20. You just don't know.
Yeah. So you can only know how far from failure you might be. So, you know, if you're really close and you know you only got one more rep, then you know. So the reliability on that becomes a little bit a little bit less. And knowing that, we can then, you know, program the appropriate methodology for that. So I would use a more descriptive feedback, which I don't have my spreadsheet doing that. I essentially just give the same value of 8 RPE to more of a subjective value being challenging. So if something felt challenging, then it's an 8. If something felt hard, it's a 9. If it felt it was at the absolute limit, it's a 10. So anything over 10 reps, you'll still give me that RPE feedback. It's just the constraints of my spreadsheet. You might just give a subjective feedback of, say, 8 being a challenging number, but then at least you have your perspective on challenge.
So the key is, if you do this, if you put the same effort in the next week, is it still an 8? So it's the consistency that's the key. It's not the actual number between people. It's just, is your 8 always at your 8?
Yeah.
Right.
And the other thing with this too is that we'd want to measure the difference between, we wouldn't want to compare your 8 RPE with, you know, 2, 3, 4, 5 reps and 10, 11, 12. They're different.
Of course.
The, you know, our 10, 8 to 10, 8, so let's say 10 to 12 reps, that category is not the same as measuring 5. So you would want to measure them separately. And yeah, that's what I do. So if I'm measuring something like 5 RPE, you know, if I'm going to change that to 5 reps, I'm going to all of a sudden change that to a double. I can't use the same numbers. I might use it to have some idea where you might be for a double, but it's not it's not the same character, because now you're getting closer to that high skill end of, you know, singles and doubles. So yeah, reps in reserve can be another method you use to regulate training load. How far from your absolute max? And a lot of the research supports is that, you know, we want to be just shy in terms of muscle hypertrophy. You want to be just shy of it, because we're able to actually create more training volume without hitting maximal thresholds. In terms of strength training, we probably want to be a little bit further away. Say, you know, instead of 1 to 2 reps, you maybe make 2 to 3 reps away from maximal effort to get the best stimulation for strength and tissue tolerance and slow adaptation progression from a further distance, say 4 reps working to 3 to 1 reps in reserve, getting closer and closer to your 1 rep, so that we have an adaptable progression. From change, because normally at the start of a preparation we're making some sort of change to the person's technique or something else, and then we're going to create that adaptation towards that 1 RM. Another form of, did you have something?
Yeah, so I think you're going to go into it now. So I actually, for the larger rep ranges, it doesn't really work, but I find for my anything 3 reps to 1 rep, I gauge it mentally. What feels challenging to me is based off the speed of the bar. Like it's how basically if I'm slow, if I'm crawling to the top of my squat and I'm pushing everything into it, I know I'm at 9.5, 10, right? But even if it feels like I couldn't do that many more reps, but the speed of the bar is fast and I've exploded to the top, I generally know that's about an 8. And that's how internally I've kind of started doing it. But I know, were you going to go towards?
Yeah, a little bit. So it's like, so your subjective feeling for that number is then objectively measured through my load calculations, so that you have a comparison in the following training slot for that. Another part I was going to go into is videos, which is more for your own feedback to have a look.
Yep.
Because something can feel shit but look good as well. And that's more to do with an individual's psychology.
Yep.
Or psychological approach to that, or just simply the way they may feel that day, but isn't respective or doesn't show in terms of their neural output. Now, videos can help provide a coach another tool to then try and give a little bit more objectivity to that subjective information. Me looking at videos is still subjective based off my skill of looking at lifts for a very long time. Will give me indication about what it really is. So using their feedback and my feedback and give an indication about maybe the disparity between what they feel and what I think it should feel, and giving them a better idea about what that RPE should feel like. And this is more so with new lifters.
Yeah, and this was my problem. This is what I've realised since I've been training. I've not been training that long in powerlifting, but what I think my max is, or what I thought my max was not even close, because I didn't even know what it was like to push myself that far. So I had no idea, and obviously that worked backwards down all the RPEs. Like it was just way off. Like my at first my 8, I would say was a 7 or even a 6. Like I was just completely uncomfortable pushing myself to those levels. So I basically called it that.
And that's why I need videos too.
Yeah.
Because then I can then look at the difference between what it should be and what it is. Again, that's just a coach's eye development. Then we can move into more objective measures. So which is velocity-based training.
Right. So that's why I brought up the fact that I mentally check my velocity. But I thought that's what you were going to go into next, because you use that with all your top lifters, right? Like,
yeah. More of the top lifters, because it's an expensive investment, and most new lifters aren't willing to invest that much money into buying a velocity device.
I would love one, but what are they, like $700?
Yeah. So velocity-based training, we've done a few podcasts on this. Velocity-based training essentially is another form of, the way we do it is another form of regulating training load. So the one thing we can rely on is that there is a direct correlation between your 1RM and velocity. Right. So we can create a linear model, or a linear regression model, to compare velocity and percentage to 1RM. From this, we're able to then work out what your velocities should be at around an 80%, any sort of percentage of intensity. So 80, 81, 82, no matter what the percentage is. And so this separates anyone from wanting to be overly zealous with their lifting. This will also bring individuals who underestimate their own capacity, and this will also separate the psychology of how they're feeling, and also give them a way to regulate their load based off their recovery for that day. So this keeps us right on the desired stimulus we want. So if you want them at a very particular, so to draw a comparison to the difference of its level of accuracy, the index of measurements I use is essentially a replication of trying to draw a roadmap.
Yeah.
So if I had a roadmap and I wanted to give them directions, essentially I would show them where to go, right? Then I would send them off on the way. If I want to find out where they are, they'll have to give me, let's say, a check-in to then work out where their location is. So you can use this. This is like, say, in military, we would give a location. We would give some form of location to find out where the troops are. On that map, and we only do that by checking in via radio to then find out where they are. This is a lot like programming. So they'll give me feedback, and it gives me an indication about their location.
But you can only. But the point there is that you can only do it at set points, and it's when they communicate with you.
Yeah. So at those points,
Yeah.
I can then get an idea about the distance they are between where they are on that map, and then I can then make decisions to bring them back on path or get them in the direction that they need to be going. The velocity is like a GPS system, right, and tells them where they are exactly, and tells them where to go and how to correct live within the second they're lifting.
This is set to set. This isn't after 4 weeks. Okay, check in where you are. Let's get you back over here. This is after each individual set. You know exactly where you are and what the next set needs to be.
Yeah. So you'll do your first set, and they'll give you instant feedback about where you should be, or what you should be hitting, and so then you'll hit those training loads. Now, yes, it may increase or decrease over that set. If it increases, increase your load. If it decreases, I generally don't tell them to decrease their load. I generally tell them to sustain it, because usually that's accumulative fatigue from the set. Normally, like the same thing, it takes a while for some people to warm up. So then as they warm up, they'll find their training load, and then they'll hit their loads and at the exact location we want them at. So rather than saying, I need you to hit an 8.5 RPE, I tell you to hit 0.41 meters per second velocity. Now, same thing, there is a margin of error for it when it comes to them, because they have to build up to it. Their lifts aren't always perfectly consistent. So same thing, I'll give a velocity range with correlation with their velocity load or training load, so which is relative to their percentages. I would then, based off their percentages week to week, based off their velocity, I can then create a index model. So then reverse engineer where their estimated training loads might be for the following week, depending on how they're progressing. So we might increase their training loads, decrease or increase by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6%. So then we have a more accurate estimated training load in comparison to their velocity that need to be hitting. So at this stage, I'm doing that manually, building an algorithm for that as well. But yeah, it's essentially the velocity is an expression of neural drive, and accurate description of neural drive, and so that we can know exactly how well that person is lifting for that day, how recovered they are, how fatigued they are.
Amazing.
And have them pinpoint, come in right on time with their velocity. I also have issues with lift. Some lifters still been overzealous.
Right. So I was going to say that. So this will, because people can convince themselves they should be able to lift more, or they convince themselves they can't lift what they should be able to lift, right? Because your psychology can override a lot. So this stops that, because it tells them what to go to next. There's no subjectivity in whether they think they can go further or not.
It tells them that they've overdone it.
Right.
So at least they have some feedback straight away telling them, no, you weren't strong enough that day, but you did it anyway.
Right.
And same thing. I still gotta let them make their mistakes. They do it, and that individual, he peaked way too early. He was constantly hitting 0.05% higher, or 5 meters per second faster every set, because he already jumped and he needed in his head to progress every single week. And so he did that.
That's something that I struggle with.
And he peaked about 4 weeks too early. So by the time it came around to testing and deload, he was done. He was absolutely gassed. I made him aware of it, but there's what more can I do than tell them what they need to be aware of until they do it, make the mistake, then they won't do it again. And he's not. This time he's not.
So it's so funny that's literally me. That's literally, I'm doing it right now.
Yeah.
Like I've gone past your auto-regulation top end the last 3 weeks. Definitely in my squat. Because just that gotta push it. Like I said, it's like.
But it's only going to be a detriment to yourself.
I know.
And then you wonder why we're not progressing the way we're progressing. And and it's fine. Like, I let people do it,
Yeah, you got
you
it.
know,
Yeah.
and they'll learn their lesson.
I feel like I've learned my lesson just from doing this. So,
Yeah.
okay. Back to the plan.
Exactly. Always stick to the plan. Just stick to the plan. Like, even a bad plan's better than no plan.
Yeah.
You just got to have some sort of plan, because just doing what you want to do doesn't have a level of predictability and allow us to then make changes to create adaptation
Yeah.
through some sort of predictable model, which is a program.
I mean, it is worth pointing out that this most of this stuff only applies when you have a coach, because I mean, you can't just take a cookie cutter program, and it's hard to apply this stuff without somebody providing some objectivity into the mix. And obviously, you program week to week, right? So every week you are looking at it and adjusting it
And
week to week. So
for me, that's a service I provide.
Yeah.
Because I know the attention requires to get, to fine tune things. But, I could write these programs, and my algorithms that I created would auto-regulate the whole training at the same time. Doesn't mean I'm not making some sort of intuitive or smart decisions. It just, out of my years of knowledge and understanding on how people work, how programs work, been able to develop proprietary formulas on my own to then create a projectable model based off projectable models used in science, and so the same scientific models used to project the weather, climate, how we travel to the moon, and whatever it is the same models I use to try and do this. Well, probably not as accurate as physics, but it's more of a utilizing subjective information plus subjective information in combination to create some sort of projectable model.
Yeah.
So.
Fuck.